An investigation into the strange structures crowning the domes of so-called religious buildings leads to unexpected discoveries. It forces us to take a fresh look at the accepted history of architecture. Our starting point for this investigation is a major event from the early 20th century, the Exhibition of 1913, held to celebrate the tricentennial of the Romanov dynasty. The grand idea behind this artistic composition was to recreate the atmosphere of a trading square in an old Russian city, demonstrating the greatness and traditions of the empire. The project was led by a famous architect of the time, Alexander Ivanovich Romanov. However, the result raises a lot of questions for the modern researcher. The building that was supposed to embody a traditional church turned out to be quite strange. When examining its architectural features closely, an unusual detail catches the eye. The spire is crowned not by a classic cross, but by a mysterious trident. One could easily explain this anomaly as a fashion trend of the early 20th century, writing it off as modernism, or the unique vision of an architect wanting to give old forms a new sound. It would seem that an artist's creative impulse doesn't have to strictly follow canons. But this convenient theory falls apart if we turn to historical documents created long before the era of Art Nouveau and the birth of the architect himself. Studying the albums of foreign travelers from the 17th and 18th centuries, we encounter an inexplicable phenomenon. Practically identical structures are captured on their pages. Drawings made by eyewitnesses hundreds of years ago depict structures that official history classifies as churches. Yet their appearance decisively does not fit into either Orthodox or Catholic canons. For example, a church near Narva in old engravings appears as a complex engineering structure that bears little resemblance to a place of prayer. A similar picture is observed in Nizhny Novgorod. Although in later reproductions artists may have drawn crosses over the finials, the geometry of the domes themselves remains invariably strange and functional, rather than decorative. Another striking example is a stone tower in Pskov, a sketch of which has been preserved in a book from 1799. The shape of its top strikingly resembles those very fantasies that we see in the projects of 1913. It turns out that 17th century travelers, visiting lands that had long been under church administration, documented with precision unusual forms that cannot be written off as accidents or a lack of artistic skill. If these were isolated cases, one could speak of an artist's error, but the systematic nature of these images makes one wonder. The coincidence of early 20th century architectural solutions with sketches from 300 years ago suggests that the architect Romanov was not reinventing the wheel, but perhaps trying to reproduce a style that actually existed, which is now forgotten or intentionally suppressed. "I'm an artist. I see it this way," doesn't work here. The matches are too precise. If the 1913 photograph can still be called a stylization of Russian architecture, then the engravings of Olearius or Witsen are a record of fact. These structures suggest that we are looking at traces of a global system where religion may have acted as a cargo cult, preserving the external form of technical devices but losing the understanding of their essence. And the most amazing thing is that similar structures are found not only in Russia, but also far beyond its borders, which completely changes the scale of the puzzle. Delving deeper into archival materials, we face the need to rethink the very concept of artistic fiction in the context of historical documentation. If we view the albums of 17th and 18th century travelers not as collections of free fantasies, but as reports from eyewitnesses, a completely different reality opens up before us. Particular attention should be paid to sketches of structures in the vicinity of Narva. The building recorded by the artist of that time possesses structural features that are simply impossible to classify within the framework of traditional temple architecture. Instead of the usual smooth lines and canonical crosses crowning the domes, complex, angular mechanisms and geometric shapes installed on the tops of towers are captured on paper. These forms evoke associations with industrial objects or technical nodes rather than with places of worship accepted in the Christian world. A similar situation can be traced in engravings depicting Nizhny Novgorod. Here, an even more intriguing detail is observed. On some old images, it is visible how artists or restorers of later eras tried to inscribe familiar symbols of faith over strange, obviously technological finials. However, the base of these structures remains unchanged. It is alien to church canons. This creates the impression that religious attributes were added later, like an attempt to adapt an incomprehensible heritage of the past to the current needs of the cult. No less indicative is the sketch of the stone tower in Pskov, dated 1799, as well as images of so-called garden houses. Their tops amazingly reproduce those very modernist tridents and spires that the architect Romanov would try to recreate a century later. A logical question arises. Why, in territories that had been under strict church rule for centuries and where any deviation from dogma was severely punished, did such architectural liberties exist and get documented? The version that European travelers, whose task was precise cartography and description of the area, massively suffered from hallucinations or intentionally distorted reality, does not hold up to criticism. They drew what they saw. And they saw structures whose functional purpose, apparently, differed from what was attributed to them later. These temples, with tridents and spheres instead of crosses, stood on Russian soil as silent witnesses to a different era. A logical question arises. Why, in territories that had been under strict church rule for centuries and where any deviation from dogma was severely punished, did such architectural liberties exist and get documented? The version that European travelers, whose task was precise cartography and description of the area, massively suffered from hallucinations or intentionally distorted reality, does not hold up to criticism. They drew what they saw. And they saw structures whose functional purpose, apparently, differed from what was attributed to them later. These temples, with tridents and spheres instead of crosses, stood on Russian soil as silent witnesses to a different era. It is generally accepted that such architectural delights are a local phenomenon, or the result of the specific development of Russian architecture. However, if we expand the geography of our search and move thousands of kilometers south to a completely different climatic and cultural zone, a real shock awaits us. What we are used to considering unique features of northern architecture, or the oddities of local artists, is found in the sands of Africa and on the streets of ancient cities in the Middle East. There, among minarets and mosques, stand structures that are like two peas in a pod, similar to the mysterious towers of Pskov and Narva, forcing us to doubt the official version of the origin of these architectural forms. Shifting the focus of our research from northern latitudes to the hot African continent, we discover facts that completely confuse the neat picture of the official history of architecture. In the Sudanese deserts stand structures traditionally called mosques. However, one should turn to linguistics to notice an important nuance. The word mosque itself, derived from an Arabic root meaning a place of worship or prostration, did not initially carry a rigid link to a specific denomination as we understand it now. It is a term denoting a functional place for connection with higher powers, and apparently, the architecture of these places was universal long before the division into familiar religions. Studying the walls of these Sudanese places of worship, the researcher is surprised to discover symbolism that seems inappropriate in the Islamic tradition, but is painfully familiar to anyone who has studied Russian antiquities. The walls clearly show images of the so-called forked cross, a specific symbol often found on white stone slabs discovered in the foundations and necropolises of old monasteries in Russia. This geometric coincidence is difficult to write off as an accident. What is the probability that stonemasons in the depths of Africa and masters of medieval Russia used the same specific pattern without having any connection with each other? The shape of the buildings raises even more questions. We see the classic tent roof style. Architectural historians have claimed for decades that tent-roofed temples are a unique native Russian invention, which was later banned by church reforms. We are told that this style was born out of wooden architecture and has no analogues. But then how do we explain the presence of identical stone tents in Sudan? If we follow official logic, Russian architects must have traveled to Africa to build there, or vice versa. But the absurdity of the situation becomes obvious if we look at Western Europe. In the famous French abbey of Fontevraud, there is a structure that tour guides call a kitchen. However, if we remove this domestic label and evaluate the structure objectively, the very same tent-roofed temple appears before us. The complex system of chimneys, turrets, and the central vault looks like a highly complex engineering and cult structure, not a place for cooking food. The version that monks built a kitchen by copying the complex sacred forms of tent-roofed temples looks unconvincing. It is much more logical to assume that the building was already standing there, and the new owners, the monks, simply adapted it for household needs, naming something they no longer understood a kitchen. All these facts, forked crosses in Sudan, tents in Russia, and kitchens in France, point to the existence of a single architectural standard, a global style that covered vast territories. It was a standardized development that different cultures later adapted to their needs, inventing different names for the same forms. But if walls and roofs can still be explained by borrowing, the elements crowning these structures baffle any traditional historian. To understand the true purpose of these complexes, one needs to raise one's head higher and examine what is at the very peaks of the domes of Cairo and Damascus, where, instead of religious symbols, traces of completely different technologies have been preserved. If we shift our attention from massive walls and foundations to the very tops of religious buildings in the Middle East and North Africa, the researcher encounters a real paradox that cannot be ignored. Studying architectural panoramas of Cairo, Jerusalem, Tunis, and Damascus from the 19th century, we expect to see traditional religious symbolism typical of Islam or Christianity. However, instead of canonical crescents or crosses reaching into the sky, on the spires and domes, we discover a whole arsenal of incomprehensible structures, which upon closer examination resemble engineering equipment rather than sacred signs. Instead of an elegant crescent symbolizing faith, domes are often crowned by strange geometric figures. Rings broken at the top, resembling open circuits, or spheres pierced by metal rods. In Cairo, for example, on old images of mosques, one can notice structures where the middle crossbar of what should be a cross or crescent is unnaturally bent upward, forming a shape similar to a tuning fork or spark gap. In Damascus, the situation is even more indicative. The tops of minarets are decorated with objects that are difficult to call anything other than bagels. These are toroidal shapes strung on a spire, sometimes in combination with egg-shaped capsules. These elongated ellipsoids, often surrounded by thin rods, evoke direct associations with insulators of high-voltage lines or capacitor elements, but certainly not with decorative ornamentation. The abundance of such forms creates the impression that we are looking not at religious objects, but at a complex technical network. If you look at these cities through the eyes of an electrical engineer, then mosques and temples turn into a unified system of stations. Broken rings can perform the function of receiving or transmitting a signal. Toroids serve to accumulate a charge or create a magnetic field, and spires work as lightning rods or antennas for collecting atmospheric electricity. This assumption is supported by the fact that such decorations are found everywhere and are standardized, from Tunisia to Jerusalem, ignoring the cultural differences of the regions. It is hard to imagine that different peoples simultaneously decided to decorate their shrines with abstract eggs and antennas purely for aesthetic reasons, without conspiring with each other. Of particular interest is how these finials look as a complex. These are not isolated cases, but a mass phenomenon forming a kind of antenna field over ancient cities. The geometry of these devices is strict, utilitarian, and devoid of the ornate nature inherent in Oriental ornament. Metal structures on roofs contrast sharply with stone masonry, as if they were installed there for a specific practical purpose, the meaning of which was lost over time, and the devices themselves turned into objects of worship. People began to pray to what once, perhaps, gave them light or energy. This technological dissonance becomes even more obvious if we lower our gaze from the roofs to the ground. Against the backdrop of majestic structures topped with complex metal structures, life flows by, appearing hopelessly backward. Architecture demonstrates signs of high technology and deep knowledge in physics, while the inhabitants of these cities in old photographs look as if progress has bypassed them. This contrast between the high-tech ruins of the past and the primitive, everyday life of the 19th century population leads us to another oddity of that era, an inexplicable degradation in the military sphere, which questions the linearity of historical development. Investigating the oddities of the 19th century, it is impossible to ignore another glaring paradox that concerns not architecture, but warfare. If we look at battle scenes and the equipment of armies of that time, there is a sense of global regression disguised as progress. This is especially evident when comparing European troops, considered the pinnacle of civilization, and the warriors of the East, inhabitants of the Caucasus, Asia, and the Arab world, whom Western historiography often called backward. Let's recall the War of 1812. The clash of the armies of Napoleon and Alexander I. Soldiers on both sides went onto the battlefield in dress uniforms, shakos with plumes, and, most surprisingly, in tight white leggings. This uniform may have looked impressive on parade, but in the conditions of real combat, it represented an absurdity. By this time, artillery was already widely using canister shot and shrapnel. Shrapnel is a type of shell filled with hundreds of metal bullets that explodes in the air, covering the enemy's manpower with a hail of lead. Canister shot acts similarly at close ranges. Against such weapons, the thin fabric of leggings and cloth camisoles offered absolutely no protection. European commanders essentially sent their troops to certain death, lining them up in tight rows where every soldier was an unprotected target. The abandonment of metal armor in 17th century Europe was officially explained by the appearance of firearms, which allegedly made armor useless. However, this claim does not withstand scrutiny by practice and logic. At the same time, the so-called wild peoples of the East, Afghans, Persians, Circassians, warriors of India and Egypt, continued to use chainmail, bracers, and metal shields right up to the end of the 19th, and in some places, the beginning of the 20th century. They were in no hurry to change into fashionable European pantaloons. And, as history shows, they were right. Chainmail, although it did not stop a direct hit from a bullet fired at close range, offered excellent protection against fragments, ricochets, spent shrapnel, and cold weapons. In combat conditions, where a significant part of injuries is caused specifically by secondary damaging elements, the presence of armor significantly increased the chances of survival. The correctness of the backward peoples was confirmed by the First World War. When German troops faced the realities of trench warfare and heavy fire, they suddenly remembered the Middle Ages. Assault squads began to dress in steel cuirasses, use heavy helmets, and even trench clubs resembling maces. Officers put on protective elements, saving them from small fragments. That is, in the 20th century, the advanced European army returned to what it had abandoned 200 years ago, and what the peoples of the East had preserved. This fact suggests that in the period from the 17th to the 19th century, a strange loss of knowledge about safety and efficiency occurred in Europe. People seemed to forget obvious things, replacing functionality with external aesthetics. The abandonment of armor was not evolution, but a degradation of the art of war. And here we come to the main conclusion. If humanity could ignore common sense regarding the protection of its own life for centuries, forgetting the purpose of armor and chainmail, then it is quite likely that the same amnesia befell other spheres. Perhaps people just as easily forgot the true, technical purpose of those cyclopean structures that we customarily call temples, mosques, and city fountains today, using them only as decorations or objects of cult. Returning to the topic of architectural inconsistencies, it is necessary to pay close attention to a category of structures that often pass under the harmless name fountains in historical inventories and guidebooks. However, upon detailed study of old images from Malta, Baghdad, and Tunisia, it becomes obvious that these objects have little in common with hydraulic structures designed to supply water. We are presented with massive, freestanding structures, often made in the form of covered pavilions or small towers, the functionality of which causes bewilderment. If we accept the official version, it remains a mystery why a simple water source needs such a complex superstructure, topped with the technical elements we are already familiar with. The tops of these so-called fountains are decorated with the same specific details as the domes of temples. We again see metal spires on which spherical objects, resembling eggs or toroidal figures looking like voluminous rings or bagels, are strung. In the context of decorative art, these elements look alien and crude, but from the point of view of engineering thought, they fit perfectly into the scheme of some device. The presence of a complex metal finial on a stone pavilion suggests that initially, this could have been a device for generating or converting energy, perhaps even for condensing moisture from the air, but certainly not a decorative fountain in the usual sense. Over time, the technology was lost, the water stopped flowing, or electricity stopped being generated, but the sacred attitude towards the object remained, and it continued to be copied without understanding the principle of operation. If we look inside some Eastern cult buildings that often neighbor such fountains, the oddities become even greater. The interiors of a number of mosques and mausoleums, recorded by artists and photographers of the past, show a striking resemblance to the arrangement of Orthodox altars. We see a structure resembling an iconostasis, and even small architectural forms inside the building, topped with onion domes identical to church domes. But the most intriguing thing is the chains, cables, and numerous suspensions hanging from the ceiling, filling almost the entire space under the dome. Their quantity and density are such that they are difficult to perceive simply as fixtures for lamps. This complex system of suspensions looks more like technical rigging, the insides of a huge transformer or distribution board, where shielding or creating a certain field is important. Combined with external antennas, this creates the image of a giant resonator. One gets the impression that the builders, or rather those who restored these buildings, tried to reproduce a complex technical unit using the materials available to them: stone, brick, and simple chains. This is a classic example of a cargo cult, reproducing the external form of a complex mechanism in the hope that it will work, without understanding its internal physics. The stone casing copies the device housing, and the chains mimic the wiring. Thus, we see a unified picture of technological amnesia covering vast territories. Fountains that cannot provide water without pumps, and temples hung with chains, are parts of one mosaic. To assemble this puzzle completely and see the scale of the system that existed in the past, we need to compare these findings with symbolism scattered even further, from the sacred cities of India to the very heart of Russia. where the same signs are discovered on the towers of the Kremlin. The final part of this large-scale investigation leads us to the need to connect seemingly incompatible things and geographic points. If we move from the deserts of the Middle East to densely populated India, we find that architectural anomalies are not just present there, but take on a systemic character. Indian temples, abundant with intricate carvings, are topped with structures that, upon closer examination, are identical to those we saw in Europe and Africa. Particularly standing out are finials resembling tridents or specific claws. These elements are often interpreted as religious symbols of local deities, but their geometry and the method of installation on the peaks of high spires force us to doubt an exclusively sacred purpose. The most striking discovery awaits the researcher if these Indian tridents are compared with architectural elements decorating the heart of Russia, the Moscow Kremlin. On old images, and even on some surviving elements of the Kremlin towers, one can discover the very same claws, bifurcated or trifurcated finials, which official history often interprets as stylized eagles or simply decorative ornament. However, the complete geometric coincidence with Indian, Sudanese, and European analogues excludes the version of accidental resemblance. It is impossible to imagine that architects of different continents, separated by thousands of kilometers and religious dogmas, accidentally arrived at the same specific technical form. All the collected facts, from forked crosses in Sudan to antennas in Jerusalem and identical spires in Moscow and Delhi, come together into a single picture, frightening in its obviousness. We are dealing with a global architectural standard, a unified style that covered the planet long before the formation of the nation-states and religions we are used to. What we call temples, mosques, and cathedrals today were, in all likelihood, the heritage of a single high-tech civilization. These buildings originally had a technical purpose, whether it was energy generation, atmospheric electricity, or providing communication. The modern perception of these structures is a classic example of a cargo cult. Imagine savages who found a working airfield but do not know how to use airplanes. Over time, the equipment breaks down, knowledge is lost, and descendants begin to pray to the skeletons of airplanes, building copies of them from straw and stone in the hope that the gods will bring them gifts again. Humanity has treated the heritage of the past in exactly the same way. Complex technical devices were turned into objects of worship. People forgot the physics of the process, but preserved the external ritual, replacing functional elements with decorative copies, and control rooms with altars. The final point in this question is the existence of documentary evidence from the early 20th century that does not fit into the familiar picture of the world at all. One of the photographs of that period captures a structure so fantastic that it is easier to mistake it for a frame from a science fiction movie or a skillful fake than for reality. It is a gigantic, incredibly complex metal structure resembling a Tesla generator or a futuristic transmitter, towering over a city where horse-drawn carriages drive through the streets. The very existence of such an object in an era when, according to textbooks, the limit of technology was steam engines, destroys the linear chronology of history. This is proof that quite recently, literally 100 years ago, remnants of technologies existed right next to us, the operating principle of which we still do not understand, and which were irretrievably lost or intentionally destroyed, leaving us only beautiful legends and strange domes.